Hello, my name is Matthew Eby, and I am the Executive Director of First Street Foundation. And today I am joined with Dr. Ed Kearns, our Chief Data Officer, and Dr. Jeremy Porter, our Chief Research Officer, to talk about our wildfire model, the implications of our wildfire model, and the tool Fire Factor that is powered by all of the research that we've created and the methodologies we've deployed. So I will start off with this presentation explaining the details of why we wanted to do such a big and audacious task. I'll then pass it over to Dr. Kearns to run through the methodology of what we deployed over the last year and change. I'll then give you a run through of Fire Factor to understand the individual property characteristics that we have and what goes into the tool itself. And then we'll summarize everything at the end with Dr. Jeremy Porter talking about the implications research nationally and what we've found across the country as we measure fire risk today and into the future. So to start, I will share a few slides around the high-level risks that we see within the country today. So why did we do this? Well, the way we look at climate risk at First Street is that it's a big problem that needs to be solved with communications and implications data, because there's no easy, accessible, accurate, or trusted way to understand risk at a property level. And with that, we see three main problems. One, climate risk is continuing to grow, and we see that through NOAA's $1 billion plus natural disaster list that is a big hockey stick up and to the right. All the best research around this are really dense peer-reviewed reports or things from the IPCC or the UN that are really hard to understand. We're talking about 1 degree warming and the implications of it and the downstream impacts, but they're just left there in silos and your average American just can't understand them. And that leads to the third problem, which is people are buying, selling, and renting homes and deciding where to live without an understanding of what risk really is. So that's why we created Flood Factor. So our first foray into this, we went and we created an open source, peer-reviewed and climate-adjusted model that's at a 3-meter resolution. So we could know every 3-meter pixel across the country, what the likelihood of flooding was, the depth of water, and then we could apply that to homes and tell people what is the risk of flooding today and how it will change over the next 30 years, the period of a mortgage. And that's great and done with the best modelers in the world, but it's only as good as the amount of people that get to see it and the solutions that they can deploy. And so that's where we're able to partner with great sites like realtor.com to integrate all of this data so people see it in the buying, selling, and renting process. So we solved this for flood, but flood alone is not enough. When we look at wildfire damage, we see that it is, as mentioned before, a big hockey stick up and to the right. So over the last 2 years, we've seen $28.2 billion in damage from wildfire. And that is more than the first 3 decades that NOAA has been tracking wildfire damages. And if we were to project that into the future for the remaining 8 years of this decade, we would see that we would almost triple the damage from the last decade. But either way, it is this astronomical up and to the right chart that is showing wildfire damage is just exponential. So we want to use our same playbook that we did for Flood Factor to create Fire Factor by leveraging the smartest people in the country and in the world to really look at wildfire risk nationally and be able to apply that to individual properties. So that's where we found this great group of individuals representing everything from weather to climatology to fuels and vegetation, and then the actual built environment so that we could achieve that. So to talk about the implications or the methodology of what we were actually able to deploy with these folks, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Ed Kearns to run through the model itself.
Thank you, Matt. There we go. So to create this model, as we did with flood, we're following the same playbook as Matt mentioned. We are building this model upon open government data. And one of the most important government data sets we're working with is the Forest Service's Land Fire Database, which measures the fuel type and concentration and density across the entire US at 30 meters resolution. Last time that the land fire database was updated was 2016, so we had to collect a lot of other information about the disturbances to bring it up to date for 2021 conditions. So disturbances are wildfires that have happened in that time period over the last 10 years. That includes prescribed burns, other fuel treatments such as thinning that have gone on that are done to reduce fire risk. So we wanted to include all those disturbances into the fuel layer so that we have the best characterization of what the fuels are across the US before we start our fire modeling work. Next, we collected a 10-year time series of weather. So the fire behavior model that we're going to be talking about is very sensitive to the weather conditions. Also, the fuels themselves are impacted by weather. And to do the type of simulation that we're going to be talking about, which is called a Monte Carlo simulation, which we're going to be doing simulations of all possible permutations of wildfire moving across the landscape. So to do so, we need a time series that is representative of a wide range of weather conditions. And to do so, we used a 10-year time series from NOAA of surface weather from 2011 to 2020. We used that time series to drive the fire weather model for a simulation of 2022 conditions. So to do this, we run the model 100 million times, all different permutations of weather being driven by historical ignition locations to come up with estimates for 2020 fire risk. Similarly, to extend this out to 2050, we use the IPCC CMIP-5 climate models using the RCP 4.5 curves. And we follow those projections and we bias correct that same time series to be representative of what the weather conditions are going to be in 2052. Then we run this fire behavior model another 100 million times, again, to fully describe what the possibilities are in 2052. What comes out of this this simulation, and again, we're using a fire behavior model that's open source, open and transparent, called Wildfire. We combine all the results of those simulations, and of those 100 million simulations, we get about 9 million to 10 million that grow to a size in the model that is worth tracking and describing. And then we represent the fire hazard as a function of 3 different variables. One is the fire probability, so whether that 30-meter pixel will burn or not. The fire intensity, the maximum flame length and average flame length at that location, and also the ember spread. Wildfire has a component that predicts where embers that are the firebrands are being thrown ahead of a wildfire, where they land. We also include that in our fire hazard maps. And we bring this together into a 1 to 10 score that represents the fire exposure on that property, the likelihood of that property, of that parcel, being exposed to wildfire over the next 30 years. Then for any building on those properties, we assess every building independently. We collect the information about the building's vulnerability to wildfire. And with flood, the vulnerability of a home to flood, it's really how high the first floor is. But with wildfire, it's much more nuanced. It includes things such as the slope that the parcel is on, the construction materials what the house is made of, what the roof is made of, but also some smaller characteristics such as what kind of windows does it have? Is it single pane or dual pane windows? Are there screens on the soffit vents that would keep embers out of the attic? These things are also very important. For some, we can leverage public databases. We can also impute some of these through machine learning methods, and others we have to use as building codes and years built as proxies to determine the vulnerability of every building. Some things we can compute. So the defensible space, which is the possible clearing around a building, if it's clear of vegetation, this is one of the biggest variables that helps determine whether a home is going to survive in a wildfire. We can measure this from aerial imagery and satellite imagery, so we have. So we've measured that defensible space for every home in America. And with that, Jeremy, Matt, I will pass it back to you.
Great, thank you so much. And so with all of that information, as Dr. Kearns was just bringing us through, we're then able to not only calculate that for every home, but turn it into something that's useful, something that people then can understand and action themselves. So what we originally created was flood factor. So you'd go to floodfactor.com, type in any address, and see your home's risk of flooding today and into the future. But now that we've built on that with Wildfire, we actually are moving over to riskfactor.com so that we can continue to build on the perils outside of just flood, including wildfire today, heat, air quality, so on and so forth, so that we can give you a full picture of risk over time. So with risk factor at riskfactor.com, you can now type in any address and it will pop up a list of potential addresses to match. You select your home and it'll bring you to an overview summary of your risk. So whether you have a severe flood risk, as this home does, or an extreme wildfire risk, you see the whole summary at the top and are able to run through the risk for each individual peril as you scroll through. But for wildfire, which is the new one that we're adding today and the focus of this, we've chosen a high risk property to give you a real understanding of what the data shows you. So does this property have risk? As Ed mentioned, we're able to look over a 30-year period, and as probabilities annually grow, so the likelihood from climate change grows, so too does that likelihood as you have longer term exposure. So if you own a home for 30 years, you're going to want to think of it not only just as an annual risk, but how does that compound over time? So that's what the first graph shows you, is that this home has a 32% chance of being in a wildfire over a 30-year mortgage, a 30-year period. But then we want to know, how is that changing from climate? Not just what is my likelihood over that period of time. And that's where you can see here that it has an annual chance of 0.75 today, 0.75%, but that more than doubles over the next 30 years from climate change. So visually, you can see on the map what it looks like 30 years from now and what the risk looks like today. And as mentioned, while this risk might not seem like a lot on an annual basis, it means that it has a 32% chance of being in a wildfire at least once over a 30-year mortgage. And with the model simulations we were just talking about, those 100 million runs today and 100 million runs in 30 years, we're able to then look at those simulations to say, of those wildfires that reached the property, how high were the flames? So it's a proxy for how hot they are. And we see on average that the flames were 3 feet that reached this property, but they could be as high as 8 feet in certain simulations. So it gives us an understanding of how hot it is, as I was mentioning, that intensity, to then bring that together with, well, the wildfire damage to the property. So because we're able to use satellite imagery to understand nearby vegetation, we know the roof type of properties and how combustible they are, whether it's asphalt shingles or cedar shake or whatever it might be, and we know what the buildings are made up of. We can then look at this to say, well, there's a lot of trees near this home, that the material that the home's built out of is very combustible, or that the roof itself is very combustible, and match that with the fire intensity that we forecast with our simulations to then give us an understanding of how combustible this home is. So if those wildfires made it to this home and this property, this home has a 50% chance, basically a 49% chance of combusting and being totally destroyed. So this allows us to understand not only likelihood of wildfire to reach the building, but if it reaches that building, what then happens to it? Outside of this, we really want to know, well, how many historic fires have come near my property or my home? So we've been able to assemble a database of wildfires since 1984, so we can tell you how many have come within 20 miles. And then within that, what are the closest ones that have gotten to my property? So what we can see within this is that there's 39 wildfires that have been recorded within 20 miles of this property since 1984. And one of the most recent ones that started in October of 2019 came within 8 miles of this property and actually had 1,400 properties within that burn perimeter. So we can see where the burn perimeter was on the map in location to the property that we're looking at. The last thing we talk about from a risk perspective is the community. So because we know each individual property, we can then say, well, for my county, how many properties are at risk? How many residential properties? How many commercial properties? Or how many social facilities? Things like churches or government buildings or schools, or what critical infrastructure is at risk? Things like utilities, things like hospitals, police stations. And so we can give a summation of risk overall. And then lastly, and most importantly, what can I do about it? Now that I understand my risk, what should I be doing before, during, and after a wildfire. So we have a whole solution section devoted to giving people the best information they need, followed by an understanding of why all of this is changing. So why is climate changing making wildfires so much worse over the next 30 years? It has to do with air temperature changes, precipitation pattern changes, and decreasing humidity. So heat, water, and then just general humidity. And then lastly, we allow you to click back to see what's going on with your flood risks as we saw at the beginning. So that's risk factor. I now want to pass it over to Dr. Jeremy Porter, who can then run through our implications. So now that we have risk at a property level and we've calculated it for every home, not only from an exposure standpoint, but from the likelihood of that structure to then combust from that exposure, we're then able to look nationally and then understand where are these pockets of risk. So Dr. Porter, if you wouldn't mind, we'd love to hear about the implications.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I'll share the presentation on risk. One of the bigger things that we ran into while trying to measure risk is that there really is no metric around what significant or meaningful wildfire risk is. So unlike flood, which everyone's familiar with, the 1% or 1 in 100 year sort of gold standard around flood risk, on fire, no such thing exists. So one of the first things we had to do was sort of grapple with what is meaningful fire risk. So we thought about it. We ended up focusing on fire risk as a cumulative metric, and ultimately we decided that a meaningful set of cumulative fire risk would be 1% over 30 years, or what turns out to an annual likelihood of wildfire of 0.03%. So most of the implications that we're going to walk through on this slide set are going to be focused on that 0.03% annual likelihood as sort of the floor of our meaningful wildfire risk metric. So this first slide, the map that you see on the actual slide set is our underlying hazard layer. So the underlying hazard layer is a 30-meter wildfire risk hazard layer. It shows you the risk at any given 30-meter resolution pixel across the country. And you can see that the actual wildfire risk or likelihood ranges from just above 0% to 7.8%. Any of the gray areas are areas that don't have risk in our models. From the national risk implications, there's a few things that are important to point out. First of all, as both Ed and Matt pointed out, our risk metrics end up being categorized into what we call a fire factor, or a risk category associated with risk, in a way that simplifies the metric for individual properties. So we have a fire factor that ranges from 1 to 10, where 1 indicates minimal risk, and all the way up to 9 and 10, which indicate extreme risk. In our model, anything from moderate to extreme is about an approximation of that 0.03 risk, or what we're thinking of as meaningful fire risk. But just from looking at the national numbers on the table that are on the slide in front of you, you can see that about 14.3%, or over 20 million properties, have moderate risk of wildfire. Nearly 6 million properties have major risk of wildfire, or a fire factor of 5 and 6. 2.7 million properties have severe wildfire risk, or a fire factor of 7 or 8, and 1.5 million have an extreme fire factor of either 9 or 10. Those national implications are certainly different if you look at the variability across the country. So when we look across the country, we see a little bit of a different story. One thing that pops out right away is the large amount of fire risk that exists outside of the West. Oftentimes we think of wildfire risk as a Western issue, but if you look at our metric here, we have over 11 million properties that have at least moderate risk of wildfire risk, or in our moderate category, and 28.5 or 28 million that have minor risk of wildfire. That's a huge number relative to the West. Although if you look at the West, you can see that the wildfire is actually distributed in a way where there are more properties in the more significant fire factor scores, like extreme, severe, and major. If we wanted to break down those numbers even further, we can look at that distribution across the country. The map to the right shows it's a county level map where each point is an indicator of a county, where the points are then scaled by the number of properties in that county that have at least 0.03% annual burn probability, or that cumulative risk of 1% over 30 years. And from that metric, you can see California pops out, Arizona pops out, there's some hot spots in New Mexico, But what's really interesting, again, outside of those western states, Texas, states along the Gulf, especially Mississippi, Alabama, and into Florida, and then on through South Carolina and North Carolina, there's a lot of risk that generally goes unknown from a national level. In particular, places like Los Angeles, Dallas, Austin, Denver, and Orlando all have a lot of risk around those metropolitan areas. And when we think about those areas, those urban cores, we're generally talking about so the wildland urban interface or the suburban areas where residential properties start to interface with more rural areas. From the table, we can see the largest percent of all properties with at least 0.03% annual risk today. We see again, those tend to be in the Southwest. We see Riverside County, California, Maricopa County, Arizona. So we're in Los Angeles, the Phoenix area, but we also see places like Polk County, Florida pop up. Ocean County, New Jersey, for instance, is one that pops up. The Pine Barrens in central New Jersey, for instance, have a significant amount of fire risk. So this sort of goes to show you that there's a lot of risk across the country that oftentimes is in places that we don't think of as having high amounts of fire risk. When we look at the top 20 counties by the highest percent of properties with at least 0.03% annual burn probability, Los Alamos County, New Mexico has 98.9%. Almost all properties in the county have at least 0.03% of annual burn probability. Other places, Mason County, Texas, Hardin County, New Mexico. Again, this area, these counties tend to be predominantly in New Mexico, Texas. There's a few in Nebraska that pop out, some in the Great Plains states of South Dakota. But these are places where almost all of the properties in these counties have at least 0.03% risk this year, which again is about a cumulative 1% risk over 30 years. When we look at change over time, one of the things that popped out in our analysis, especially at a national level, was we already know that wildfires is significant in the West. It's high. There's a higher likelihood in the West. There are more properties and are higher fire factor scores in the West. But one of the things that's occurring over time is we're seeing dramatic growth throughout the Southeast and on up the East Coast and even up through the Appalachians. So from this map, you can see a significant growth in wildfire risk relative to what it is today across really the eastern half of the country, in particular the eastern half of the country in the Southeast and up through the Appalachians. Notice that there are a lot of gray areas in the Midwest and Northeast. These are areas that for this metric weren't included in the analysis because they don't have significant or meaningful risk or risk above 0.03% annually in 2022. So they weren't included in the change metric. And when we look at the counties that have the largest growth over the next 30 years, Greer County, Oklahoma pops out 56% point difference. So the actual percent today and the percentage into the future are 56 percentage points difference moving out 30 years. Shelley County, Georgia, Washington County, Georgia, Jefferson Davis County, Georgia, all of these are places that didn't necessarily pop out in our percent of properties with at least 0.003% risk this year, but they were places where the growth is very large. So what we're seeing is that fire risk is starting to spread into places where it wasn't before. There's a large amount of growth. Some of that's driven by the smaller numbers today versus into the future, but it shows a strong climate signal in that wildfire risk is actually moving from just being a problem in the West and what we saw earlier in the Southeast to more of a national problem with changes in the environment. One thing I'll point out at the bottom left-hand side of the screen that we have our wildfire national report available at firsttree.org. On that report, there's all of these implications are included. There's more information about national implications that are included there, but there's also state pages. So for all pages that have, or for all states that have significant risk, we've included 3 pages of risk for today, risk into the future, and historic risk to those states. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Matt to close up.
Thank you, Dr. Porter. So as you can see, a tremendous amount of work and effort to not only bring together the world's best modelers, but to then create this model that no one had thought was possible before, and then turn it into actual products that your average consumer can use and understand, and give us our first look at national risk across the country. So if you're looking for risk understanding, go to riskfactor.com. If you're looking for data understanding, as Dr. Porter just went through, please visit firststreet.org and you can see our national report there. And if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out at info@firststreet.org. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today. And we look forward to releasing more products in the future.